Next, we come to checkpoint screening. With respect to checkpoint screening, federal rules required air carriers to conduct screening to prevent or deter the carriage aboard airplanes of any explosive, incendiary, or a deadly or dangerous weapon on or about each individual's person or accessible property, and the carriage of any explosive or incendiary in checked baggage. Passenger checkpoint screening is the most obvious element of aviation security. At the checkpoint, metal detectors were calibrated to detect guns and large knives. Government-certified X-ray machines capable of imaging the shapes of items possessing a particular level of acuity were used to screen carry-on items. In most instances, these screening operations were conducted by security companies under contract with the responsible air carrier. As of 2001, any confidence that checkpoint screening was operating effectively was belied by numerous publicized studies by the General Accounting Office, the Department of Transportation's Office of Inspector General. Over the previous 20 years, they had reported repeatedly serious chronic weaknesses in the systems deployed to screen passengers and baggage for weapons and bombs. Shortcomings with the screening process had also been identified internally by the FAA's own assessment process. Despite these documented shortcomings of the screening system, the fact that neither a hijacking nor a bombing had occurred domestically in over a decade was perceived by many within the system as confirmation that it was working. This explains in part the view of one transportation security official who testified to the Commission that the agency thought that it had won the battle against hijacking. In fact, the Commission received testimony that one of the primary reasons that the CAP's consequences were restricted was because officials thought that checkpoint screening was working. The evolution of checkpoint screening illustrates many of the systemic problems that face the civil aviation security system in place on 9/11. The executive and legislative branches of government and the civil aviation industry were highly reactive on aviation security matters. Most of the aviation security system's features had developed in response to specific incidents rather than anticipation. Civil aviation security was primarily accomplished through a slow and cumbersome rulemaking process, a reflection of the agency's conflicting missions of both regulating and promoting the industry. A number of FAA witnesses told the Commission that this process was the bane of this rulemaking process was the bane of civil aviation security. For example, the FAA had attempted to set a requirement that it would certify screening contractors. The FAA Aviation Reauthorization of 1996, in fact, had directed the FAA to take such action. The 1997 Gore Commission endorsed it, but the process of implementing screener certification had still not been completed by September 11th, 2001. Those are systemic observations. But to analyze the 9/11 attack, we had to focus on which items were prohibited and which were allowed to be carried into the cabin of an aircraft as of that date. FAA guidelines were used to determine what objects should not be allowed into the cabin of an aircraft. And I stress again that this is the system that was in place on 9/11, not the system that is in place today. Included in the listing of items not allowed into the cabin of an aircraft were knives with blades 4 inches long or longer, and or knives considered illegal by local law, as well as tear gas, mace, and similar chemicals. These guidelines developed by FAA were to be used by screeners to make a reasonable determination of what items in the possession of a person should be considered a deadly or dangerous weapon. The FAA, in implementing it, told the air carriers that common sense should prevail. Hence, the standards of what constituted a deadly or dangerous weapon were somewhat vague. Other than for guns, large knives, explosives, and incendiaries, determining what was allowable was up to the common sense of the carriers and their screening contractors. To write out what common sense meant to them, the air carriers developed, through their trade associations, a checkpoint operations guide This document was approved by the FAA. The addition of the guide in place on September 11, 2001, for example, classified box cutters as restricted items, which were those that were not to be permitted in the passenger cabin of an aircraft. In those cases, the checkpoint supervisor was required to be notified if a box cutter, as an item in that category, was encountered by a screener. Passengers would be given the option of having the box cutter or similar items transported as checked baggage. Mace, pepper spray, and tear gas were categorized in the operations guide as hazardous materials, and passengers were not allowed to take items in this category onto an airplane without the express permission of the airline. On the other hand, pocket utility knives, which were defined as those with less than a 4-inch blade, were expressly allowed onto aircraft. The checkpoint operations guide provided no further guidance on how to distinguish between box cutters and pocket utility knives. One of the checkpoint supervisors working at Logan International Airport on September 11, 2001, recalled that it was her understanding as of that day that while box cutters were not permitted to pass through the checkpoint without the removal of the blade, any knife with a blade of less than 4 inches was permitted to pass through security. In practice, we believe the FAA's approach of admonishing air carriers to use common sense about what items should not be allowed on an aircraft, while also approving the air carrier's checkpoint operations guidelines that define the industry's common sense, in practice created an environment where both parties could deny responsibility for making choices that were, in the tenor of the times, likely to be hard and most likely unpopular. What happened at the checkpoints on 9/11 under these guidelines? Of the checkpoints used to screen the passengers on flights 11, 77, 93, and 175 on September 11th, only Washington Dulles International Airport had videotaping equipment in place. Therefore, the most specific information that exists about the processing of the 9/11 hijackers is information about American Airlines Flight 77, which crashed into the Pentagon. The staff has reviewed those videotapes as well as testing results for all of the checkpoints in question, reviewed scores of interviews with checkpoint screeners and supervisors who might have processed the 9/11 hijackers on that day, and reviewed FAA and FBI evaluations of all available information about the 9/11 screening. From what we have seen to date, there is no reason to believe that the screening on 9/11 was fundamentally different at any of the relevant airports. Return again to the perspective of the enemy. The plan required all of the hijackers to successfully board the besieged aircraft, the assigned aircraft. If several of their number failed to board, their operational plan would fall apart or their operational security might be breached. To have this kind of confidence, they had to develop a plan they felt would work anywhere they were screened, regardless of the quality of the individual screener. We believe they developed such a plan and practiced it in the months before the attacks, including in test flights, to be sure their tactics would work. In other words, we believe the hijackers did not count on a sloppy screener. All 19 hijackers were able to pass successfully through checkpoint screening to board their flights. They were 19 for 19, 100%. They counted on beating a weak system. Turning to the specifics of Flight 77 checkpoint screening, at 7:18 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time on the morning of September 11, 2001, Majed Moked and Khalid Al-Midar entered one of the security screening checkpoints at Dulles International Airport. They placed their carry-on bags on the X-ray machine belt and proceeded through the first magnetometer. Both set off the alarm and were subsequently directed to a second magnetometer at Dulles. While Al-Midar did not alarm the second magnetometer and was permitted through the checkpoint, Moked failed once more and was then subjected to a personal screening with a metal detection hand wand. He passed this inspection and then was permitted to pass through the checkpoint. At 7:35 a.m. that morning, Hani Hanjour, believed to be the pilot of the 77, placed 2 carry-on bags on the X-ray belt at the checkpoint and proceeded without alarm through the magnetometer. He picked up his carry-on bags and passed through the checkpoint. 1 minute later, Nawaf and Salim Al-Hazmi entered the same checkpoint. Salim Al-Hazmi successfully cleared the magnetometer and was permitted through the checkpoint. Nawaf Al-Hazmi set off the alarms for both the first and second magnetometers, and he then was also hand-wanded before being passed. In addition, his shoulder strap carry-on bag was swiped by an explosive trace detector and then passed, and he too was admitted through the checkpoint. Our best working hypothesis is that a number of the hijackers were carrying permissible, under the regulations in place at the time, permissible utility knives or pocket knives. One example of such a utility knife is displayed by Mr. Brinkley here, is this so-called Leatherman item. We know that at least 2 knives like this were actually purchased by the hijackers and have not been found in the belongings the hijackers left behind. We are passing this around now, and please be careful. The blade is open. It locks into position. It is very sharp. According to the guidelines as we understand them that existed on 9/11, if such a knife were discovered in the possession of an individual who alarmed either the walk-through metal detector or the hand wand, the item would be returned to the owner and permitted to be carried on the aircraft. Once the hijackers were able to get through the checkpoints and board the plane, the last layer of defense was onboard security. That layer was comprised of 2 main elements on 9/11, the presence of law enforcement on the flights and the so-called common strategy for responding to in-flight security emergencies, including hijacking, which had been devised by the FAA in consultation with industry and law enforcement officials. However, on the day of September 11th, 2001, after the hijackers boarded, they faced no remaining significant security obstacles. The Federal Air Marshal Program was almost exclusively directed, as of that date, to international flights. Cockpit doors were not hardened, and gaining access to the cockpit was not a particularly difficult challenge. Flight crews were trained not to attempt to thwart or fight the hijackers. The object was to get the plane to land safely. Crews were trained, in fact, to dissuade passengers from taking precipitous or heroic actions against hijackers. We'll have more to say about the common strategy in the staff statement.